Hello and welcome to Bird & Bird's Retail Therapy podcast, where we explore the trends, changes and legal aspects of the retail and consumer industries. I'm Nicola Conway and I'm a Senior Associate in Bird & Bird's Retail and Consumer team.
And I'm Sana Malik. I'm a trainee solicitor also at Bird & Bird. In today's episode, we're going to discuss green claims and greenwashing within the retail and consumer industries. We're joined today by Constantin Eikel, who is a partner in the Bird & Bird Düsseldorf office. Constantin, would you like to kindly introduce yourself and a little bit about your practice?
Thank you for having me. I'm Constantin. I'm a partner at Bird & Bird in the Düsseldorf office in Germany, and I focus on soft IP, which is trademarks, designs, copyrights, unfair competition, and especially advertising. And within advertising in the last 5 or 6 years, a big focus of my practice has been green advertising, so environmental advertising, but also social advertising.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for joining us. Perhaps you could kick us off with just defining what is a green claim?
That's a good question. When we talk to clients or with colleagues, at first, when you hear green claim, most people think about text. So if you go to the supermarket and you see a bottle and on the bottle it says made from recycled plastic. So this is a text green claim. But what many do not consider is that it could also be an image. For example, an icon, a leaf, a droplet on the bottle that indicates some form of environmental aspect. And it could also be a color or a type, a way a product is made. For example, if a product is printed to look like cardboard, this could also be a green claim. So it's not just text, it can be anything that communicates environmental aspect.
I have to say that in the UK, at least, we're seeing tons of green claims via text at the moment, and particularly on consumer goods packaging. So if I go to a supermarket or really any sort of retail door, I can see so much language such as carbon neutral or climate neutral, plant origin, without microplastics, made with less plastic, made with recycled plastic, recyclable, biodegradable, compostable. There's just so much at the moment.
Yeah, it's really a lot what you see on the market, and you have picked the most common examples here. I think neutral in particular, which you mentioned, carbon neutral, climate neutral, whatever you can be neutral, is the most used claim at the moment. And then anything with recyclability. And as I mentioned, icons and imagery. If you ever go to the supermarket and consciously look at the packaging, you'll see that these claims are everywhere and you really can't miss them anymore. And I can't go to the supermarket anymore without seeing them. Might be an issue with my job, obviously, but they are everywhere.
Constantin, when does a green claim become greenwashing, and what's the issue with greenwashing itself?
So a claim becomes greenwashing when a brand aims to make themselves or a product when they try to have it look more environmentally friendly than it actually is. So if they have no basis for their claims, if the claim is going beyond what they have a basis for, and at that moment you can talk about greenwashing. So when the claim is not in line with reality. And then you have some environmental and consumer organizations that denounce the company or the brand and allege that they are greenwashing. There are many examples of that. As we mentioned, climate neutral is one where sometimes you have organizations talking about greenwashing, but it's also more general and ambiguous claims like good for the environment and the planet, or sustainable, which everyone uses because it's a good term that captures a lot of things, but it relatively quickly can become greenwashing, at least in the eyes of these organizations. And these claims have a very high risk if they aren't substantiated. So this greenwashing thing is not only a legal risk, but also a PR risk with these organizations putting out press releases and so forth. So there's a lot of stake for the companies. Even imagine you put a claim on a packaging and it's objectively true, but it cannot be understood by the consumer. It is misleading, it cannot be verified, or important information is not on the packaging that should be there. For example, the language is too complex and consumers can't understand it. Even though the claim is true, if the consumers can't understand it, you're already either in or very close to greenwashing. So maybe I give you a few examples. You might fall into greenwashing if you are claiming to contribute to the reduction of global greenhouse gas emissions, when this is not true. This could, for example, be the case if companies use offsetting projects in South America, in Africa, that do not have the scope which the company might believe that the scope is. So it's much smaller than it actually is. If you claim that your product is good for the planet without specifying why it's good for the planet, it's just a bottle of a cleaning agent and it says good for the planet on it, and there is no explanation. That's a good example of greenwashing, claiming that you have less gas emissions than your competitors without having data to back it up. Also a common one. Or you're only looking at a very narrow part of the life cycle and you do not look at what happens when my product is discarded, and you ignore this part even though it has a major impact on the overall footprint of your product. So these are all examples of potential greenwashing.
It feels like everyone's talking about greenwashing, so there is greater awareness around it, but it's still really prevalent, which I find a bit confusing. So, the European Commission collected some green claims data in March 2023 that suggested that in 53% of green claims, the claim is vague, misleading, or based on unfounded information. So, these constitute an unfair commercial practice. What's your view on why these are still so high, even though the awareness is there now?
So I think we have the awareness, we have laws in Europe that should be used to tackle greenwashing. But in some states in Europe and globally, these laws are not being enforced as much. And because it's a complex issue, even though there is awareness, still some claims will remain misleading and vague simply because the consumers can't understand it. The 53% you cited come from a study of the EU. I think it was conducted in 2020. And while some experts disagree with the number and think it's slightly lower, I think it is clear that there are misleading claims on the market. No one can really dispute that. And we saw 2 to 3 years ago a very prominent example of that. Suddenly, lots of things were made from ocean plastics. So you saw bottles, plastic bottles that said, or even bags and sunglasses that were made from ocean plastics. And if you take a moment and think about what is ocean plastics, and I do this as an exercise with lots of our clients, and I ask the marketing departments of our clients, imagine ocean plastics. What is that? You think about an ocean and you have plastic floating in it. But actually, ocean plastic has, in most cases, not touched water. So I want to repeat that. Ocean plastics has not touched water. What ocean plastics is that plastics is being collected and recycled in communities that live close to rivers, in regions and countries where recycling is maybe not available. And by offering the recycling systems, the plastic is not thrown and flushed into the river and does not end up in the ocean. So it actually prevents ocean plastics. This is inherently a very good thing, but the branding is misleading because it is not ocean plastics. And nowadays, the term used for that is ocean-bound plastic. So whenever you see ocean-bound plastic somewhere on the market, you know, okay, this has been collected in communities where there is a risk of plastic ending up in the ocean. So it is a good thing. Companies are doing good things, but when they talk about it, they create an impression that is not completely in line with the reality. So that is often the case when we talk about greenwashing. There is a good thing beneath the surface. It's just the way you talk about it that needs to be improved.
That's really interesting, Constantine. Thank you so much for going into ocean plastics and just how much that means for the consumer and just how pervasive the misleading marketing can be. Nicola, I know that the UK consumer team advises clients quite frequently on how they can do better with their green claims. So what are some tips you're giving at the moment?
Yeah, we do. And obviously, the advice we give really depends on who we're talking to because clients in different sectors, such as the food sector versus the beauty sector, they do have different considerations that they need to keep in mind. But if we talk in general terms and think about some overarching ideas to think about, I can give you what we like to call our noteworthy nine. So forgive the list, but hopefully these are quite helpful. Number one, consider what evidence you have before making any claims and ensure that you can substantiate each claim being made. Number two, base environmental claims on the full life cycle, not just part of the life cycle of the product, unless you're clearly stating otherwise. Number three, ensure that the claim is true and easy to understand. That goes back to what Constantin was just saying. Number four, double check that the evidence you're using in support of the claim is up to date and from verified scientific sources. These shouldn't be opinions, these should be evidence based claims. Number five, think of how your audience will interpret the claim as a whole and what the overall impression will be. This isn't a question of what you as the company thinks or means. This is a question of what the average consumer will think and understand. Number six, if because of space or sizing issues, you can't easily fit all of the relevant and all of the important information onto the advert or the packaging, don't just omit it. Find another way. You must communicate it. So maybe think about making it accessible in another format, for example, via a QR code or a link to your website. We're seeing a lot of that now. Number seven, ensure that if there are conditions or caveats to a claim, these are written next to or very near to the claim. Again, this is about making it really clear and easy to understand. Number eight, if you're using comparisons, make sure that they're fair and they're accurate, and again, that they're easy to understand. You shouldn't be disparaging or discrediting any of your competitors. And actually, that's a general rule for advertising in the UK, not just for when you're using green claims. And number nine, where you can, choose specific claims rather than generic claims, unless you've got really strong evidence to support a general claim.
Thanks so much, Nicola. That was very practical, and hopefully lots of our clients can take note of that. Constantine, rather than looking at the do's and turning to some of the don'ts, so maybe kind of flipping Nicola's answer on its head, what, in your view, should a company avoid doing instead so that they're not greenwashing?
That is a very good question, and it depends on where you are. So every country has slightly different don'ts, but there are overarching themes, and I think if you follow these, you have a good chance of being compliant in many different countries, because it's very hard to review your claims in all countries where you might have footprint with your business. So here are 10 rules I try to give to my clients to keep in mind when creating green claims. Don't make a claim about a feature of the product which is standard or necessary to comply with legal requirements. So you cannot advertise for something you must do. Don't make misleading statements. This is an obvious one. Don't cherry pick information that suits the claim you want to make. So don't omit something that might be a bad look. Don't use symbols or words for which you do not know the precise meaning, because if you don't know it, the consumers will definitely don't know it. Don't hide any clarification or qualifications so that they are difficult to see for the consumer. I know this is something which the marketing always loves to do, have a big bold claim, font size 30, and then have the disclaimer font size 4, white font on a white background. But this is not something you can do. So it should be clearly visible to the consumers. Obviously, don't make untrue claims, but also don't make claims which are only partially correct. Don't exaggerate the evidence you have in order to make a more impressive claim. Don't use statements without explanations. So this is really a big one. A very common theme in all countries is that green claims need explanation. You cannot make a green claim without explanation. And don't compare the environmental credentials of your product or business with others if they are not like for like. So only compare similar things, and don't make claims about future goals and ambitions, be it of a product, be it of your company, without clear, objective, and verifiable commitments and targets. And I think this is something that goes out to almost all companies on the market, which have goals like by 2030, we will be X, Y, Z, whatever they want to be. You should publish goals and ambitions with concrete steps so that you can be held accountable, which is something that the EU will also bring as a law, and we will get to that later. But already we see this as an important step for courts nowadays.
Lots of food for thought here. And Constantine, I appreciate that you've just mentioned that different laws and therefore different enforcement regimes would apply in different countries. But in a general sense, what are the possible repercussions for companies who are greenwashing?
You're absolutely right. It depends on the jurisdiction in question, but in many EU member states, the local authorities can impose fines. Consumers can in some countries bring a private action to sue for breach of contract. Consumers and regulators alike can apply to local courts to seek consumer protection compliance if consumer rights are being infringed upon. Regulators and courts can also require that the advertisements or the offending products be removed or withdrawn. So if you have a claim on the packaging of your product, you could be forced to remove the product from the market. And in particularly serious offenses, there may be options to pursue criminal actions, but in reality, these are rare cases. For example, the regulators in the Netherlands, which force companies to make voluntary donations in the amount of up to 1 million euros. And in Germany, for example, you could be faced with a preliminary injunction forcing you to remove your claim within 5 working days. So there is really pressure on this depending on where you are. It might be a fine, it might be simply that you're forced to remove certain claims. It is different on a country per country basis. And whilst we're touching on the applicable law, the EU has big plans for green claims. So number one, you have the directive on empowering consumers for the green transition. It has been adopted and it will come into effect in 2026. And number two, you have the Green Claims Directive. The latter is still a draft, but they will significantly change how green advertising is regulated in the EU. And if you believe in the Brussels effect, which means that the laws of the EU have an effect outside of the EU as well, simply because it's easier for companies to follow the stricter standard rather than doing a country-by-country approach, these laws will have an effect outside of the EU as well. And these laws, they will increase enforcement. So the EU wants every member state to set certain fines for greenwashing, and the maximum which each member state must implement is 4% of the turnover of the company. This does not mean that the courts will necessarily impose 4%, but it should be an option for the court. And some member states will and have already for other laws gone beyond, and they have imposed or made available to the courts fines of up to 10% of your turnover. So if you are accused of greenwashing and the court agrees, you might lose a significant portion of your turnover. And not just for the product, but of your whole company. Additionally, your revenue can be confiscated and you can also be temporarily excluded for 12 months from public procurement processes and from access to public funding, including tendering procedures, grants, and concessions. So this might not be a big thing for everyone, but for those that are part of public procurement processes or funding, this is going to be a big one.
It sounds like it. And if the directive on empowering consumers has already been adopted, could you possibly give our listeners a cheat sheet on what that means for a retailer?
Yes, absolutely. I've been closely following the developments around the directive for several years now. And essentially, the Empowering Consumers Directive introduces several changes and prohibitions for businesses making environmental or social claims. Some of the key ones are generic environmental claims, for example, green, eco-friendly, biodegradable, will, if they are not used with context, so if you only use the claim, will be subject to very strict requirements. And the requirements are so strict that some people talk about a ban for these terms. So it might be that certain words like sustainable, eco-friendly will almost be like they were banned because the requirements will be had to be met. There's also new rules on comparative claims. So for example, our product is greener than the competitors' products. Usually lawyers advise for comparative claims to be careful because they are a minefield already, and to not name the competitors and so on and so forth. But the EU will force you to name the competitors, name the products against you which you compared, and so on and so forth. So there will be lots of laws about comparative green advertising, and labels and symbols. So sustainability labels will be standardized to avoid confusion. This is very impactful for all clients, especially in the retail and consumer sector, because they will no longer be able to make their own labels. This is a big change for everyone.
Wow, okay, so that sounds like it has scope for massive impact on retailers. Could we get into a little bit more detail on this?
Sure. So I already mentioned a bit about generic claims. So essentially, if you use one of the big words, sustainable, eco-friendly, and so on and so forth, if you give it context on the same medium, you will be subject to the Green Claims Directive, which is yet to be adopted. But if you don't give it context, you just use the big word, the big claim, you're subject to the Empowering Consumers Directive, and it's treated as a generic environmental claim. And to use a generic environmental claim, you need to demonstrate excellent, recognized environmental performance. And this long and very hard to decipher definition just means you need to fulfill certain EU or national member state standards, so official standards. And if you fulfill an official standard, and if it's relevant to your claim, you can still use these generic words. But I'm fairly certain that for eco-friendly, for example, the EU, who essentially wants to ban these words, they will not put out a standard that justifies these words. So for many products, the list of generic claims within the directive can be seen as almost a ban. And then you have the sustainability labels. If you go into a supermarket today, you as a consumer see about 200 sustainability labels, different ones. So sustainability label means an icon, can also be text, but mostly icons. They look like a seal, they indicate a certain quality, and sometimes they do look like they were granted by a third party. But many of them are actually owned by the brands. And there's nothing inherently wrong with that. For example, if a brand highlights a more sustainable product category within their product portfolio, and to highlight this, they use a green tree icon on the back of their products. It's not inherently bad, but this is what the EU wants to prohibit. And there's only two ways to use sustainability labels in the future. One, it's made by public authorities, which is not helpful for brands, obviously. And secondly, it must be based on a certification scheme. And a certification scheme essentially means a triangle of parties. The brand, the owner of the label, and the verifier, whether or not the product fulfills the requirements, must be independent parties. So any brand that has a sustainability label, or something that is considered a sustainability label, either needs to stop using it by September 2026 or transfer it to a third party that is independent and open it up to everyone. So this is a very big change, which many companies are not aware of. And you could say now, why should I care about something that happens in September 2026? Well, depending on what kind of product you make, the products you design today are still on the market or even only enter the market in September 2026. So this is a very big change. Then you have new laws on future environmental performance, which essentially means if you advertise your goals and ambitions by 2030 we will be, you need the clear, objective, and verifiable commitments I already talked about. But additionally, you need a third party to verify your progress towards the goal. And you need to publish this. And this new law is coming because too many lawyers, like myself, have said, well, if you're not absolutely certain, just put "we plan to be" in front of your claim, and then it was much less risk. But the EU obviously noticed that, and now Any plans need monitoring and publication. And the last big change is on greenhouse gas emission offsets. So the most common one is carbon neutral. If you use offsetting for your carbon emissions, you cannot claim or imply that your product or service is neutral or positive for the environment based on offsetting. This cannot be justified anymore with offsetting, and this is going to change the use of neutrality on the market because almost all of these claims are based on offsetting. So the Empowering Consumers Directive brings down the hammer on certain practices which the EU believes to be misleading. So it's for very specific things, and these are going to be very difficult in the future. And the directive is only part of many different directives which the EU is bringing on the market. You have many ESG related laws. For example, you will have the eco design for sustainable products regulation. Very shortly put, the Commission will get the power to say certain products, like a jeans, has to be made from 20% recycled fiber. I'm making up the example, but this is what it could be. And if the Commission says jeans have to be made from 20% recycled fiber, you cannot advertise anymore that you use 20% recycled fiber because you're only doing the minimum. So this is what the EU is planning with the Empowering Consumers Directive. And next to the advertising part I mentioned, they also regulate certain parts about durability, repairability, and recyclability. You cannot withhold certain information, and you must communicate how and if your product can be repaired. So overall, it, as the name implies, shall empower the consumers to make greener choices.
Thanks so much for that detailed look at what's to come from a legislative perspective. It's clear how monumental this is going to be, as you've touched on really pervasive issues. Can you provide some insight into the practical side of this? So, what are some of the tangible and commercial implications we're going to see?
I think the commercial implications right now are that companies should think about, can we sell off all current stock with claims that will not be possible anymore by September 2026? Or what we design today, programs we invest in today, will they still be relevant in September 2026? And if so, they should consider this now, consider the law, and adjust their marketing. They should also start implementing data collection in the supply chain, because the data you can collect will be relevant for many of the ESG laws which the EU is bringing out, like the Green Claims Directive, for example, where you need to communicate the data, the environmental data of your product. And this is the theme for all these laws that are coming. Transparency and accountability will be more key than ever. If and when the Green Claims Directive comes, every green claim will have a little QR code next to it for products and services that you can scan as a consumer, and it will tell you all about the environmental aspects of that specific product. So transparency and educating the consumers is what the EU is doing. And because of that, businesses will need to provide clear information about the product's environmental impact. And I think consumers deserve to know if a product's packaging is recyclable, if it contains harmful substances, or if it's energy efficient. And the directive also helps with the enforcement against companies that do not follow these rules. And because of the fines that will be possible, I think businesses will think twice before greenwashing, even though you can fall subject to greenwashing without knowing it. So I'm not saying that every company is actively greenwashing, but it can just happen. And because of that, the laws should be carefully read. And I think this can also start a shift in the marketing approach. You need to be authentic in what you communicate, and there are brands on the market that are very good at that. It's just that not everyone is, and the ones that are not yet need to follow the ones that are the trailblazers and that are authentic. And if you then have the substantiation and communicate honestly with the consumers, you will have success on the market and you will have nothing to fear from the law.
All right, businesses need to get busy, but what should consumers be doing on the flip side?
I think consumers should educate themselves, understand the labels, ask questions, and support the brands that genuinely care about the environment. The consumers and their purchasing decisions have the power to drive the change, and the companies are only doing green advertising because studies show that consumers buy the greener product, at least as long as the money allows. So essentially, it's not just the companies that become greener, but it should also be the consumers that make greener choices for a greener future.
I love that phrase when it's like consumers, you can vote with your wallets.
Exactly.
So we can also be playing our part here, I think.
Okay, so looking at all of this together, it seems like greenwashing is a relatively high risk offence at the moment. And just to tie a bow around today's conversation, we should mention that we have a green claims tracker on the Bird & Bird website. So if you're interested in knowing what legislation in this sphere applies to your company across different jurisdictions, you can use this free online tool to find out.
Let's close the episode with the fun little question that we always like to finish with. Constantin, what's something that you purchased or were gifted recently that you love?
We have recently moved into a new house and I just bought 2 trees, which seems to be very fitting to the theme of today's podcast, that I planted on the weekend. And even though I don't necessarily have a green thumb, they spark joy, and I had the opportunity to plant trees by myself, which has been a fun exercise.
Oh, that sounds lovely. I have a loosely related one. I have a new fragrance. It's billed as a unisex scent and it's called Vanilla Woods. So not quite a tree, but similar theme. And it's from a brand named The Seven Virtues, which I haven't bought from before, but I'm glad that I did. They do have some environmental messaging in their marketing and on their packaging, which I find really interesting. And it's something that, as we've talked about here today, I'm starting to notice it more and more as time goes on, and the focus on sustainability and environmentally friendly initiatives become more and more important for our purchasing decisions as consumers. Just a little bit about the scent. It's a vanilla scent profile, which I'm not usually drawn to, but it's quite unusual. I think it's quite special. When I smell it, I get a powdery, warm, ambery vanilla. It's very sweet, soft, and comforting to me, which is something we've spoken about on previous episodes as being something that can really spark joy in our purchasing. If I read out what's on Fragrantica here, it's a little bit more complex than that. It's got a top note of pear, a middle note of rose, and the base notes are expectedly vanilla, caramel, and amber. So quite a lot going on there, but it's a lovely one. Sana, what about you? What's something that you purchased or were gifted recently that you love?
That sounds so lovely, Nicola. I absolutely love vanilla. And I guess my answer would be more along the lines of Constantine's. I recently bought some chili pepper seeds, which I'm really excited to start planting. This is the first time I've started growing my own kind of herb garden and vegetable stuff at home. So I'm really excited to start with chilies. All right, and that's the end of our episode. Thank you so much for joining us. If you'd like to join us for more retail and consumer discussions, don't forget to subscribe or follow wherever you usually listen to your podcasts so that you're notified when the next episode goes live. Bye for now.